And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's forecast showing next system pulling into the Bering Sea here with the front spreading rain into the eastern Aleutians and up toward the Pribilof Islands, fair over the southwest part of the state, and area light snow shifting slowly northward here over the northeast interior, and some more light snow at times for the western and central Arctic coast, slipping on down on some northerly breezes into the Bering Strait. Weak low south of the Kenai Peninsula and a similarly weak front here, keeping it occasionally wet for the southeast coast, North Gulf Coast. Maybe some showers getting into northern Cook Inlet and the Matanuska Valley, but they'll be quite light. And then for tomorrow, remnants of that front, again, right up along the coastline, keeping the shower and rain chances going here. Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, and down across the Panhandle. Bigger storm out here over the Bering Sea, dropping southeastward and deepening as it moves southeastward here, 984 millibars. And the front bringing some gusty winds now and rain into the Alaska Peninsula, spreading into Kodiak Island, and that also pushing up along the southwest coast. Pribilof's wind and rain tomorrow, and that wrapping back around with some pretty good north to northwest winds there for the central Aleutians. And still some light snow chances there from the eastern Brooks Range to the Arctic coast. Dry over the interior now. And for the outlook on Friday, big storm here just south of the Alaska Peninsula. Again, high wind watches out for the eastern Aleutians, gusts to 70 miles an hour. That extends into the Alaska Peninsula. And pretty strong northeast winds here blowing across Bristol Bay, and gusty northeast winds, but dry for the southwest part of the state. North winds, colder temperatures coming down into the Aleutians there. And we've got high winds forecast for Kodiak Island up to 75 miles an hour in gusts. You can see pretty tight gradient here across the Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet. So storm warnings are out for southern Cook Inlet. And big increase in the winds, good full gales for Prince William Sound. Not too bad over the southeast coast, and fair over the interior. For the coastal water forecast here for the central and south coast of the Panhandle, south winds 15 to 20 knots, southeast 20 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, southeast winds at 20 with higher gusts, southeast 15 for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, southeast winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. And for Friday, winds east here for the south coast at 30 knots with seas at 12 feet. And the north coast, east winds 40 to 50 knots. Lynn Canal, north at 25, southeast 25 for both Stevens Passage and down at Clarence Strait, with the seas over the inside waters at about 5 feet. And for Cook Inlet, tomorrow, light variable winds at 10 knots, west winds 15 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Variable winds 10 knots there for the southern Kenai Peninsula. East at 15 for the Prince William Sound area. Southeast 15 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. We can call this the calm before the storm because you can see on Friday, northeast winds 40 knots there for northern Cook Inlet. Storm warnings for southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 50 knots. Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, North Gulf Coast. Storm warnings, east winds 55 to 60 knots all through this area, with seas as high as 30 feet. And for Prince William Sound, east winds 45 knots. With seas at 12 feet. And for Kodiak Island tomorrow, south to southeast winds 15 knots, 3-foot seas. Small craft advisories for the Alaska Peninsula. South to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, southeast at 30 for Bristol Bay. And then for the day on Friday, storm warnings here. Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 45 to 55 knots. Storm warnings for Bristol Bay, northeast winds at 50 knots. Kodiak Island, storm warnings. Northeast to southeast winds at 50 to 55 knots, so seas up around 20 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, west-southwest winds at 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings for the central Aleutians, west winds 45 knots, seas just under 20 feet. And storm warnings for the western Aleutians, west-northwest winds 45 to 50 knots, with seas either side of 20 feet. And then for the day on Friday here, the western Aleutians, north winds 30 to 35 knots, seas around 20 feet or less. And then storm warnings for Adak, Atka, Nikolsky, all the way across Unalaska Island. Pretty uniform. North winds 50 knots in all those areas. Seas less than 25 feet. And gale warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast tomorrow. East winds 35 knots, northeast at 20 for the Yukon Delta coast. East winds 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island, and northeast at 35 for St. Matthew Island, but south at 25 for the Pribilof Islands with 8-foot seas. And then for the day on Friday, north winds 45 knots for the Pribilof Islands, seas around 20 feet, north at 40 knots. St. Matthew Island with seas at 16 feet. Northeast winds 40 knots there for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and the Yukon Delta coast. North winds 30 knots. And swell craft advisory is also out for Norton Sound for northeast winds at 25 knots. For the central and eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, south to northwest winds at 5 to 10 knots. Pretty light winds through this area. Northwest at 15 for the western Arctic coast. Seas up to 3 feet. And the Chukchi Sea, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 5 foot seas. Then for the day on Friday, Chukchi Sea, a little breezier, north winds 20 to 25 knots, seas up to 8 feet there. And for the western Arctic coast, north at 15 knots. Central coast, light north winds at 10 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, light west winds at 10 knots with 2-foot seas.